Welcome to Ritmo alongside Coach Carlos Morales. I'm Alvaro Martin. We were at the All-Star game recently, Carlos, but let's just go back a little bit to the beginning of basketball. James Naismith, 1891, Springfield, Massachusetts. He starts the game, and he has a bunch of rugby and football players play this new game. And he was a little bit mortified how quickly the game became physical. He had to stop them and say, no, that's not how we play basketball. This is a game of skill, of aerobic activity. It was based on a game that he played as a child in Almonte, Ontario, in which you have to shoot an object at a higher target. That's where basketball came from. So since then, there's been a tremendous effort to try to take physicality out of the game and make sure the skills become central to the game. And as such, we've seen two incredible moments in the league's history where the game changed. The first one was probably based off a game in 1950, November 12th, where the Fort Wayne Pistons beat the Minneapolis Lakers and the great George Mikan, the league's first superstar, 19-18. The Pistons, the winning team, shot 13 shots on goal the entire game. The league knew it had a problem. So in 1954, they adopted the 24-second clock, and the game, of course, had more possessions, more attempts, more scoring. I think the second critical moment was the adoption of the NBA in 79-80 of the ABA three-point line. And at first, it was seen as a bit of a gimmick, but slowly but surely, of course, that begat great three-point shooters, and eventually what we call the pace and space type of game we see right now. And throughout, players have been coming into the league already working on the skills that the new rules have proposed and making the most of it. That's the name of the game, be competitive. And so you have seen offenses take off in the last few years. And as such, during the All-Star game, that was the talk of the town amongst the media. Ooh, the offense is just having its way against the defense. The defense is hamstrung. There's no balance in the game. And quickly enough, when Commissioner Adam Silver had to address the media, that question came up early in the discussion. And here's what Commissioner Silver had to say about the offensive explosion and the balance between offense and defense in the NBA today.
Jeff, so first of all, just in terms of the difference from last season to this, we're up approximately 1 point per game, just to be clear. And I want to dispel any notion that the league feels, or the league office necessarily feels, that high-scoring games in the abstract are good. I think what we want are competitive games. That's what's most important to us, and that's what we hear from our fans as well. I think there's a lot happening here, and I've talked to a lot of coaches and a lot of players about it. I think, first of all, the skill level is off the charts. I think that what we're seeing is now in this league, every player at every position has to be able to shoot the basketball. You're seeing this global pool of talent coming into the league, some of the best athletes in the world who can frankly just shoot the lights out. And I think that's partly what's responsible for the increased scoring. I disagree with people who feel that teams aren't playing defense. I mean, you've been covering for this league a long time. The defensive intensity is there. Defensive players are asked to cover larger areas of the court than they had to historically. Even this was something Larry was talking about during his interview Friday. So I actually am pleased with the state of the game. Having said that, I know there are some coaches who feel that we've hampered in some ways defensive players' ability to play defense, at least the way it used to be played. In part, that's been very intentional. There was a period of time in this league when people thought that the game had become too physical and we'd taken away some of the aesthetic beauty from the game. I was one of those people who felt that way, in the 90s. Whether or not, there need to be any adjustments or now is something that we listen to our coaches, we listen to our players, and the competition will continue to consider. And I think one thing I'd say, people think that fans like high-scoring games. I think fans like to see players have that ability to use these extraordinary talents. On the other hand, I think what we hear from fans as well is they like defensive intensity, and I think they want players to be able to play physical defense, but not in a way that it hampers, as I said, offensive players from using their incredible skills. So I'm pleased with where the game is, but it is something we'll continue to look at.
Coach, let's just start with Commissioner Silver's words. First of all, it's interesting to see that while they're paying attention to this, clearly, they don't think it's gotten to the point where it's a tremendous issue. As a matter of fact, They say that what he wants, what the league wants, and what the viewer at home or the viewer at the arena wants is competitive games. But this is when I started saying, well, and that is, there was no data on that. So we took it upon ourselves to begin to look at that for the past 10 years here at Ritmo as to how do you define competitiveness and how do you show it statistically in a way that people can absorb it. And we have some results, and they're really interesting, and they point to a league that's becoming, at least the scores, the final scores, less competitive as a result of teams having a mismatch between their offensive efficiency and their defensive efficiency. Carlos, let's start with simply margin of victory. And as we see this graphic, we see that over the last 10 years, it's gone from about 11 points average margin of victory to now about 12 and a half points. But the interesting part is that it's not necessarily a smooth line. We've had ups and downs, particularly downs. Last season, the 2022-23 season, it came down almost dramatically back to 11 points margin of difference, Carlos.
Yes, this is very important to point out, Alvaro, because last year, you're going to see on all the graphics that we're going to present, that last year was the exception to the rule. And maybe when the commissioner says that, that they are satisfied with the status of the league right now, because he's talking about being competitive, maybe taking into consideration last year, there was a down, the graphic went downward, and then it came up dramatically this year. And but 12 points, 12 and a half points per game of difference between the winning team and the losing team, that's not competitive at all, in my opinion.
No, it isn't. And it's, again, the trend line is going in the wrong direction when you smooth it out with great volatility in the past 4 or 5 seasons. Then we looked at the amount of games that are defined by a margin of 10 points or more. And again, this is points to competitiveness. And as we see the graphic, same thing, great volatility the last 4 years, but the trend is unmistakable. And this is probably the graphic that probably has to concern the league the most. We're approaching the 50% mark. Half the games are being defined by 10 points or less. The final score is 10 points or less. Now, you may tell me, well, maybe it was 5 and it opened up to 10 or more. Maybe it was 20 and it got down to 10 or plus or more. There's a lot of noise in these stats. But again, the overall average points to a league that's becoming less competitive as you see the end result of the game, Carlos.
Yes, I agree with you. But again, we have to focus on that graphic. What happened last year? No, last year was in terms of that competitive, of being competitive. We're talking about maybe 43% of the games were decided by 10 points or more, and now we're talking about almost 47% of the games being decided by 10 points or more. So, and you have a good point. You're talking about, okay, maybe these are wide margin games at the end, but were they competitive? Were they in the clutch at one time with 5 minutes or less in the game, and then the game opened up at the very end? We have to take that into consideration too.
Well, then we started looking at different cuts, and we will address the issue of the clutch later on. One of the issues we looked at is, okay, well, let's take a look at what happens before the All-Star game and what happens after the All-Star game to margin of victory. In other words, games decided, the margin of victory by games by time of year over the last 10 seasons. And that also throws a very interesting and a little bit surprising result, Carlos. It's been even, because you would think that there are players that start the season injured, then they come back and play for the stretch run. You would also think that after the trade deadline, teams kind of get together, reform, and really make use of the last 20-some games, almost 30 games, to really get in gear for the playoffs and really play playoff basketball. They're also competing for spots in the standings to try to get home court advantage, whatnot. You also have the play-in coming in, Carlos. And instead of seeing that graphic close the gap, it actually opens up the pre- and post-All-Star game. That's a little puzzling, isn't it?
And that's what's really surprising, because you would think that in the era of the play-in, now you have 10 teams that can qualify to play post season basketball, but you have the 11, the 12, and the 13 team in the same in each conference that is looking forward to getting into one of those 10 teams. So you would think, okay, during that final stretch, all the teams are playing their best basketball, or they're trying to be as competitive as possible. But this graphic says the opposite.
Yeah, the gap between them is bigger, and again, fewer teams are tanking, And yet we're seeing that gap open up between the point difference, the margin of victory post All-Star game than before the All-Star. And then we look just at broad measures. Let's take a look at the share of games that end up being decided in overtime. And again, it's a small difference, but there is a noticeable drop between the level that we had 10 years ago, in the 2014-15 season, and today, with, again, variation the last 4 or 5 years. But again, the trend line is clear. We are seeing fewer and fewer games that end up in overtime.
Well, overtime, this is, in my opinion, this is a misleading graphic, because in every league that you play, it doesn't matter if it's high school, college, FIBA basketball, NBA basketball, overtime games are very rare, are very, very unusual. So, and the difference between one year and the other is not that big, that huge. So I wouldn't take this particular graphic too much into consideration.
It does drop from about 6% to right now the trend line to be under 5%. So you're right, a small amount of share of the games, but that share is also decreasing. Another bit of evidence that there's less and less competitiveness in these games. And then, Carlos, the idea of the clutch. And so we took a couple of cuts at it. We first took a look at games that ended up in the clutch. For those of you who don't know, the clutch is defined as the last 5 minutes of a game in which the difference on the scoreboard is 5 points or less. In other words, a competitive tight game. And so we started looking at just the games that ended up in the clutch. We're talking about a difference in the scoreboard of 5 points or less at the end of the game. And that proportion is also going down. And that one's going down pretty noticeably, Carlos.
Oh, yeah, because it was like more than 27% of those games last year, and it had gone down all the way to 24%. Again, last year is like the exception to the rule, and we have to take that into consideration when the league is watching all these graphics that we're watching, or these tendencies that we're watching, if they are going to be overreact or not to what's going on, if they want competitive basketball. Because last year, if we take into consideration all the graphics that we have seen so far, one of the most competitive in the last decade. But this one is probably the least competitive if we take into consideration all these graphics.
So you're saying recency bias, people reacting to what they're seeing this year, forget what happened last year, and don't have these numbers, so they have no way of gauging where we are. The league does have these trend lines. They extend further back than we do, so they get a feel for what they're doing. And then finally, what about games that were in the clutch? They didn't finish in clutch conditions, but at some point in those last 5 minutes, the gap was 5 points or less. That's a broader gauge. And again, once again, the trend line shows that there are fewer and fewer of those games that at some point were in the clutch. Carlos, in the era of pace and space, if you have a great offense and the other team doesn't have as good a defense and you up the pace, you're going to have, this is a direct result of that, isn't it?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we had one of our viewers last week that suggested that maybe the clutch has to be redefined, that it doesn't have to be the 5 points difference in the last 5 minutes, that it could even get all the way to 10 points, because sometimes with the space and rhythm of the game, the pace of the game, we have so many possessions that 10 points is the equivalent of what 5 points were maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Well, you just touched upon my next point, which is what should the league do about this? You just mentioned a possibility that they simply, I don't know what word you want to use, change the standard and say, no, the clutch is going to be 10 points within 10 points, because the way the league is being played, there is a greater chance of you making up a 10-point deficit. And so we're going to redefine the clutch. Typically, when you mess with historical patterns and data, you have to reclassify the past. It's a little bit more difficult.
Yes, it is.
But the NBA has made changes in the past, and really, history at some point doesn't stop them from making these changes. So we'll see what happens. But there's another couple of things that could be at play here, Carlos. Number one, which you've mentioned the entire segment, which is they won't overreact. They will not overreact to this year, that year. They're watching these trend lines, but they're not ready to make that a case. But the problem that I see here, Carlos, they're about to sign a mammoth media broadcast rights deal that's going to make the league and its players incredibly wealthy. So the incentive, the change comes when you see fans unhappy, when they don't buy tickets, when they don't watch your product. And I think when you have this deal about to come, you may take away any incentive to make any changes. And the league may say, you know what, let's stay the course. and make the generations that are coming watch basketball and understand basketball the way we see it, a game of skill again, where physicality is basically put aside.
Yeah, that going to the other point, the point of how efficient offenses are right now and how many points are being scored. With a good reason, the commissioner talks about the quality of the players, the skills that level of the players, how good they are as shooters. We always talk about space and pace, but we also have to say that the rules have been worked so that the offense has a big advantage. Okay, the way that the rules have been put in the last 10 to 15 years is to give that advantage to the offense. And the commissioner said as much when he said that he and most people didn't like what was going on in the 90s when it was a very physical game. And they decided that they had to take action so that the game became more of skills and less of physicality.
Well, it's going to be interesting what happens. The other thing that could happen here, Carlos, and we talked about earlier in another segment, is the issue that they put in the three-point line, but three-point shooters didn't show up until about a generation later. In other words, it didn't become a weapon until later. Maybe the league is saying, look, we have ebbs and flows. We have teams that look for different kinds of skills. Maybe teams right now are going to be emphasizing defense, individual defense and collective defense. And we're going to see those players come into the league, and this gap will close as a result of that. Because we've seen the gap open as a result of bringing in great three-point shooters, Carlos.
Yeah, but the only problem that I have with that reasoning is that I see the players right now with their hands tied. You have to untie their hands. What I'm meaning by this is that the rules are such that it's very difficult to play great defense. I don't condone grabbing and holding and and pushing people and all that. But being able just to put a hand on a guy who's starting the drive to the basket, being able to put you in position to draw a charge after the guy gathers the ball, which is the rule right now. You cannot try to draw a charge after the offensive player gathers the dribble and start his move to the basket. Even the 3-second defensive rule could be something to talk about, even though the league has always been about not clogging that middle and letting people go into the basket so that they can have their spectacular plays that the crowd likes so much. But even the 3-second rule, defensive rule, we don't have that in any other level of basketball in the world. Make it high school, AAU, college, FIBA basketball. The only league in the world that has a defensive 3-second rule is the NBA, and it could be one of those that you could talk about getting rid of.
Well, again, even players in the NBA like Miles Turner, who played FIBA basketball and was exposed to that, said, "Hey, that's great." Of course, he would stand to benefit a lot more given his position and the type of game that he plays. But clearly, I'm sure the competition committee doesn't need our help in understanding, what can be done or not be done. Modified emphasis, rule emphasis. We'll find out. The list is already there. I'm sure they're thought about it. But again, this is part of a dynamic that started the morning after James Naismith threw the ball up in 1891. This is not new. This is just the newest factor. And so the question in front of the commissioner and the competition committee is, to what extent does making the skill of these players show up affect the competitiveness of the game and the enjoyment of the game from a fan viewpoint? That's the question that they have to answer. And I don't think they're going to overreact. And Carlos, one last thought. If there are going to be radical changes, like getting rid, for example, of the 3-second defensive 3-second rule, perhaps, and typically the league has done this before, they start doing that at the G League level. Let's say for certain quarters, the middle part of the game, just to experiment to see what effect it may have on the game before they adopt it at the NBA level. So this is what they have in front of them. It's clear that the tendencies are going in the wrong direction. It's also clear that maybe it's not time to overreact. We had a year last year that was stark difference from what we have this year. It'll be interesting to see what the league decides to do this offseason within the competition committee to address the issue of offensive dominance on the one hand and the freedom to express those skills, and on the other hand, the basic competitiveness of the show, of the game itself at the NBA level.